Okay.
Okay. Hi, and welcome to the Friends of the Boca Raton Public Library Sunday Speaker Series. We're glad you could join us today. We're here speaking with author D.L. Havlin today, and we are recording. We will have a post on our website, bocalibraryfriends.org, for any of those who are not able to make it onto this call or who would like to review the video again. And I would like to just one moment and introduce our guest. Now, everybody should check their screens and make sure they adjust their screens. So our guest, Mr. Havlin, will be having a PowerPoint presentation. So you'll see him on one side of your screen, and on most of the rest of your screen, you'll see his presentation. So today's speaker is an award-winning author, as I said, D.L. Havlin. We've had him before, and we're really glad to have him back. D.L. Havlin is an unretired businessman who's traveled a large portion of the world, having visited over 100 countries. He managed offices in places like London, Singapore, Frankfurt, Acclaimed, Spain, hope I pronounced that right, and many more places. He's visited the jungles of the Sepik River in New Guinea, the Buddhist temples in Bangkok, and the Babi Yar Monument in Kiev. In his travels, he's discovered that humans have very similar appearances, but their cultures make them as distinct as visitors from another planet. He's been writing for over 30 years, and DL writes historical, literary, women's mainstream, and suspense and mystery novels. He's published 10, maybe 11 by now, books, and the latest one is Escaping Skeletons, a mystery suspense series. He's represented by the Seymour Literary Agency, and Taylor & Seal is his current publisher. His books, manuscripts, and short stories won 14 awards, including 5 Royal Palm Literary Awards from the Florida Writers Association. Today, Mr. Havlin will be discussing Rising Love, which is perfect for Women's History Month, a very inspiring story, the Jacqueline Cochran story. And if you've never heard of her, you will be amazed. This panhandle-born girl rose from obscurity to be a giant in aviation and in business. Though not receiving the publicity that Amelia Earhart is accorded, she accomplished much, much more in a life filled with triumphs and heartbreak. At one point, she held every women's aviation record, was instrumental in forming the WAAC, Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, and the WASP, Women's Airforce Service Pilots, was an acclaimed test pilot, was the first woman pilot to break the sound barrier, and was the driving force in forming the first women's astronaut group. Wow. This is going to be amazing. We're very excited to have you here, DL. And I would ask if everybody could please mute their own microphones. So we will open it up at the very end for questions. So please hold your questions, and you'll have a chance at the end to speak and ask whatever questions. And I'm going to now turn it over to you, DL.
Thank you a lot, Faith. I hope that everybody learns quite a bit about our subject, and that is Jacqueline Cochran. She was truly an extraordinary woman. We have one person that needs to mute their unit because we're getting feedback. Okay. All right. Anyway, the Jacqueline Cochran story starts in the very early 1900s. Jacqueline was the person who has the most speed and distant records of any person living and dead. That's including Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh, Chuck Yeager. It's not even close. She holds more than anyone. And you see a picture of her at her desk as head of the WASP during the Second World War. Those are just minor claims to fame because Jacqueline Cochran was much more than just a pilot. She started from some of the humblest beginnings that you can possibly imagine. She was born on May 11th, 1906 in either Pensacola or Defuniak Springs. She's really not sure because she does not know who her parent or did not know who her parents were. She lived with a foster parent in her earliest years. She knows that her birth name was Bessie Lee Pittman, and she was the youngest of 5 children in a foster household. You can see some of the pictures of what life was like at the time, and you can also see the part of the country that she was born in. It was known as the Sawdust Road, just like North Carolina had Tobacco Road. That part of Florida had its Sawdust Road. And the situation there was poverty was the rule. And I'm talking about abject poverty here. In Jackie's autobiography, she tells us that she did not have a pair of shoes until she was 6 years old, did not sleep in a bed until she was 11, and basically in 1 week had a half of fillet of a mullet for the whole week to eat. So you can see she really came from the most humble beginnings. As I have mentioned, they lived during those hard times in one of the poorest regions of the United States in that period of time. She had an absolute minimal education. She actually spent 3 months in the classroom, and she had a teacher who she revered for the rest of her life, who taught her one thing, and that was how to read. And all of the rest of the education and the accomplishments she achieved were through reading and self-educating herself. These are some sights and sounds of the people and places that Bessie Lee Pittman would have been familiar with. If you can take a look at the housing, you can see what conditions were like where she lived. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of her at 6, okay? Most everything in that area revolved around lumbering and sawmills. So that's what you see where she lived. For a while, for example, her family lived in a boxcar that had been derailed and set on the side of the tracks, and that's where they lived for a couple of years. Bessie was married at the age of 14. She's considered a very beautiful young lady. She had a son very quickly there, and who died at the age of 5 in 1925, and her marriage ended the same year. So at 19, she had been married, had a child, had experienced the death of that child, and was divorced at that same period of time. But she was a driving individual. From her very earliest years, she was a completely fearless and committed individual who would not stop until she achieved any object that she set for herself. When Bessie Pittman divorced, she retained her married name of Cochran, and she substituted Jackie for Bessie Lee. She did it because she wanted to bury her past, and she just decided to start anew. And the way she did that was to start in a career as a hairstylist. And she was extremely successful at this. She was inventive. The people that she did work for loved her. And she started in Pensacola. And then a number of people that were in the military service that utilized her service at the hairstylist told her that she needed to go to New York if she really wanted to achieve some success. And she did. She just simply worked her way to New York and began a career there. And she had the looks and had the driving personality to get her a job at Saks Fifth Avenue, which at that time was one of the prestige hairstyling places in New York City. You can see pictures of what she looked like at 19 in the upper right-hand corner. that is her in the upper left-hand corner as well. And she did do some modeling there as a result of being spotted by people in the salon. You can see some of the hairstyles and some of the ideas of what beauty was considered to be at that period of time. The picture in the lower left is actually Jacqueline in a picture that we use for a modeling portfolio. At the time, you can see the cars in New York City and see the period of time that that she was there, that it was still a growing city at that time. One of the things that changed Jacqueline Cochran's life was that she was at the center of some controversies, and those controversies ended up catapulting her to complete change in her life. In 1928, she met Floyd Odlum, who was 14 years older. He was the CEO of RKO Pictures, Atlas Hotels, Northeast Airlines, and Bond Teller. He was one of the 10 richest people in the world in 1933. He took an interest in the hairstylist. At the time, he was married to Hortense McQuarrie, the first female head of the department store, Bond Teller. That interest in Jackie became an affair, and he financed a cosmetic business for her. And in 1935, Odlum divorced his wife, and in 36, he married Jacqueline Cochran. So now she was the center of a lot of controversy and scandal. And that's one of the things that probably has created a situation where she's not as known as she should be. Jacqueline used the devices and abilities that God gave her to try to increase her position in life, and she did so very effectively. It was a simple airplane ride that really was her springboard to fame. She took an airplane ride and she was hooked on flying immediately. She learned to fly in 3 weeks and got a commercial license in 2 years. She was one of the first 3 women in the US to get a commercial flying license. In 1934, she was one of 3 women who completed the McRobertson Air Race, which was one of the biggest air races in the world. And she was the only woman to compete in the 1937 Bendix Air Race, which had previously been all male. She set the women's world speed record that year, and she met and became very good friends with Amelia Earhart. They became almost inseparable. You can see some pictures of Jackie with her planes, and you can see she was a very attractive young woman. She became known as the Speed Queen. There's the picture in the upper left-hand corner is Jackie and Amelia at the Odlum home, sitting on a diving board by the swimming pool. You can see her in the cockpit of her airplane in front of it. Amelia is over at the right. And if you take a look at the picture in the upper right-hand corner, you can see Jackie with all the trophies she won during that period of time. She was considered one of the best female pilots in the world and maintained that reputation well into the 70s, the 1970s. She had set speed records, altitude records, and she was the first woman to fly a bomber across the Atlantic solo. She won 5 Harmon Awards as the best aviator in the world at that time. One of the things that is interesting, as a result of Jacqueline and Amelia's relationship, Floyd Odlum financed most of Earhart's trip, including her trip around the world, where she lost life making the last leg across the Pacific. Something that's really interesting is the very successful cosmetic business that Jacqueline formed. One of the things that she was interested in was that the emphasis until she got into it was to try to use the coloring and the appearance of the cosmetics as the primary item that was sold. When Jacqueline got into it, she had a concern for the effect that these chemicals had on the lady's face, and she tried to build into it things that would make them more friendly to their skin. And if you take a look at this, you'll see that the Wings of Beauty was a story within itself. She used her looks, her air exploits, and her ability to get financing to develop lipsticks and stuff that had agents in them that actually were friendly towards their lips. And she acquired Marilyn and used use of her lipstick and other cosmetics. You see a picture of Marilyn there, some of the advertised. You also see Jackie there with her airplanes in a picture sitting on the floor. But this was a very, very successful cosmetic business, very lucrative, and she became wealthy in her own right. The next picture is Marilyn Monroe in their swimming pool without cosmetics on. To make a long story short, Jacqueline Cochran was no longer a redneck from Defuniak Springs. She married Odlum 36, and we've mentioned the scandal that was involved there. But she basically stood tall and would not take a backseat. She became very prominent in the social set in New York. She was wealthy beyond her dreams. She owned her own planes. And she hobnobbed with the biggest individuals and most important people of the time. Among her personal friends were Howard Hughes. And for those of you who have never seen him, he's in the lower right corner. Odlum is the gentleman that you see on the right side. You see her, Jackie, in front of one of her airplanes, one of her biplanes there, and the racer that she spent a lot of her time in is the picture in color there on the bottom. You see in the upper left-hand corners, you see her with one of the leading aircraft manufacturers at the time. And her exploits had gotten to the point where she was famous enough that they issued a 50-cent stamp in her honor through the U.S. Mail Service. She was also was very friendly with Joe DiMaggio, FDR, and Jimmy Stewart. Jacqueline, because of her interest in aviation, saw the Second World War coming. She had spent some time in England and had actually ferried some planes over there. And so she became interested in what was happening in England. And one of the things that was happening there was the manpower shortage for the British was acute. They did not have the population base that Germany and the US have. So it was imperative that they get help in any way they could to try to free up as many men as possible for the war. And one of the ways that was they formed the ATA, and it was a group of women pilots that did all kinds of activities for the Royal Air Force. She joined the Wings for Britain and ferried aircraft to England from the US. She also recruited American women to be pilots in the ATA. And what these ATA ladies did was they basically ferried planes from the factories to the air bases to keep male pilots available to fly their fighters and fly bombers. You can see the uniforms and some of the aircraft that they flew. The picture on the lower left-hand corner, she actually is in that group, and that one of the Hurricane fighters that she piloted, helping the British move the planes from the factories to the bases. she thought that this was a great idea, and she saw the war coming to the US. And she wrote a letter to her friend Eleanor Roosevelt recommending that the US explore the possibility of using women pilots. And at that time, piloting was considered a male's job, and particularly military pilots, that was considered a taboo. But she decided she was going to press it to the hilt. She was a true feminist. When war came to the US, the relationship she had with Eleanor Roosevelt, that picture of Eleanor is in the upper left corner, really became important. She suggested that airfaring service, like the ATA. Roosevelt was very interested in it and wrote letters to Hap Arnold, who was head of the Army Air Force at that time, recommending that they look into doing that. In 1941, Cochran was asked to find pilots to do that job, and her and a lady by the name of Nancy Harkness Love were involved in trying to set up a ferrying service. They had very different ideas of how it should be done, and Nancy Harkness Love wanted to have women that had extremely extensive flight hours and that had had good educations. It was more of a sorority kind of thing, where Jacqueline Cochran wanted to throw it open to all women and train them to do it. In other words, it was great to have women that already had the hours, but she had confidence that women could fly a plane as well as a man could. And eventually she went out, and the WASP were formed. That was the Women Air Service Pilots, and Cochran was established as their leader. You can see some of the pictures of her in a fighter, her talking to some of the other ground support people there on the right. She was the driving force behind it. And one of the interesting things, if you look at the bottom, you'll see an aircraft which has got the number 13 on it, so you can identify it. That was one of the first P-51 Mustangs. It was a plane that she was asked to test pilot. She actually performed the function of a test pilot, and she mentioned that since she had flown the Spitfires in England, that this plane would be much better if they removed the engine that the North American Aviation had put in it and put the Rolls-Royce engine in it like the Mustang. That change ended up making it the best fighter and best prop fighter in World War II. The WASP were a real success. Under Jacqueline's leadership, 18,000 women signed up to become air service pilots. Of that, 1/10 of them actually passed the rigorous requirements. Jacqueline insisted that the women that signed up go through the same training regimen as the men. One of the things that they did was they did this on a shoestring. I want you to take a look on the top row. And if you take a look, you'll see the picture second from the right. They got the hand-me-downs from the men. So all of their uniforms were sized up to be men, and some of them were quite big. You can see those two ladies there look like they've been to the thrift store to get their uniforms. You can see some of the pictures that were taken of the gals. And one of the things, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see Jacqueline standing next to a P-51 with the motto on it, "Won it, a strong co-equal Air Force." She was a real believer in having women as part of the regular Air Force and being considered as a full equal partner to the men as pilots. Women did all kinds of things besides ferry pilots under her leadership. In addition to just ferrying the aircraft, eventually they did repair tests, logistic support, They taxied all kinds of people all over the world. They did equipment testing and more. They were some of the bravest people that flew during World War II. Now, one of the jobs that they got was a lot of times these aircraft would be shot up. And when I do my presentation on World War II, when I talk of the WASP, I always ask the men to stand. And the reason I ask them to stand is because of the bravery that these gals exhibited. If you can imagine, they were the first ones, after a plane would be repaired, they were the first ones to fly them off the ground to see if they were okay and airworthy. That takes a lot of guts. Just imagine after a plane has been pretty much shot apart, getting into it after it's been repaired and hoping that it will fly. So that was among the things they did. They towed anti-aircraft targets, and some of them ended up being shot at themselves, the gunners not being always what they should have been. And they were, there was a lot of prejudice against these ladies from the male pilots who were forced to admit that they were as good of pilots as they were. They did wonderful things. And one of the ladies, this is one of the incidents that doesn't go recorded, and it was frowned upon because a lot of the men in Congress at that time were very much against endangering women's lives by putting them anywhere near combat. And so when this happened, it was actually frowned upon to try to bring any publicity to it. One of the women was flying a bomber from the Azores to England. And in order to make that long haul, all the machine guns, all the armament had been removed from the boat, from the airplane, from the bomber, and had been replaced with gas cans so that she could make the trip. As she and her co-pilot approached the White Cliffs of Dover in England, suddenly ahead of them appeared an Me-109, which is a German fighter plane. And the Germans had been taught that the most vulnerable way to attack this particular aircraft, the B-25 Mitchell, was to attack it from above, from the front. In other words, to attack it straight head on. The woman pilot in question knew this and flew straight at the Me-109. There was cannon fire that she was taking, but she continued to fly and played chicken with him. And at the last second, she turned away, turned her wing over to the side and cut his wing off. And she actually downed a German fighter that way. That takes a tremendous amount of courage and flying skill. But at that time, no one wanted to talk about it. And the reason why was they felt that it would be negative press because that woman was placed in jeopardy. So you can see things have changed a bit. One of the reasons why they've changed is Jacqueline Cochran. Jacqueline always had a need for speed. After the war was over and the WASP were dismantled, she became a magazine correspondent. Remember, here's a gal that had only reading to support her education, basically. And she reported on post-war events. She was at Yamashita's surrender in the Far East, and she was at the Nuremberg trials where the Nazi officials were tried for their war crimes. She broke Jacqueline Ariel's speed record. Jacqueline was a French pilot, and she was one of the first people to fly a jet aircraft. You see a picture of her to the left. One of the things that Jackie Cochran did was she really pushed to allow the black pilots to get in, black women pilots to have a recognition. Among them was Bessie Coleman, who was a great pilot, but was not given any recognition until Jacqueline stood up for her and tried to get her into races and give her the recognition that she deserved. She broke the sound barrier. She was the first woman to do it in a Sabre jet. You see that in the middle on the bottom. You see it was a picture on Life magazine's cover. And you see a picture in the upper right corner with her and Chuck Yeager, who was one of the most outstanding pilots the U.S. ever produced. And one time, Chuck Yeager was asked whether he would fear any pilot in any air service. And he said he wouldn't fear any man. He said, as long as you don't include Jacqueline Cochran, she can fly as well as I can. That's saying a lot. There's pictures of Jacqueline with some of the aircraft that she flew during that period of time. She became known as the Air Queen in the 50s, and she really wanted to have women to have a chance to become airline pilots, and she fought for that long and hard with not much results at the time, but she was the one who was the groundbreaking individual for doing that. Take a look at some of the honors that she won. She won 5 Harmon trophies, a Distinguished Service Medal. She was the first woman pilot in the U.S. Air Force after we had a U.S. Air Force in 1947. She had 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. She was the first woman to land an aircraft on a carrier. She was 2 times Associated Press Woman of the Year. I mean, she had command of pilot wings. She was, I mean, just you can take a look at the honors that she had. It's really outstanding. She flew all sorts of jet aircraft. So you see just a few of the jets that she flew during her years in the military and afterwards. At the time of her death, no other pilot in history had held more speed, distance, and altitude records, and that quantity number still stands. She was not only a great pilot, she really was an important person in US's history. She became a political activist after the war, and she had a close association with Roosevelt and Truman, and she was often asked her ideas about women's issues. But she was very concerned about the direction the area was taking, and she was concerned that women were being left out of America's future. So she ran for Congress in '56, but lost narrowly. However, one of the really important contributions that Cochran made was she was the major reason why President Eisenhower, or why General Eisenhower became President Eisenhower. You can see pictures of him here. She had become a close personal friend of Eisenhower during World War II and in the early 50s. And without his knowledge or consent, she organized an I Like Ike rally at Madison Square Gardens and filmed the whole thing. So she was the father of the I Like Ike movement. She flew that movie to France and actually presented it to Ike and convinced him he should run for president, because until that, he did not want to. Jacqueline didn't fade away just like old soldiers do. You can see her continuing to be involved in both aeronautics and in all features of U.S. life. She was the first person to fly a fixed wing jet across the Atlantic in 1961. She flew the Goodyear blimp. She was always an avid supporter of rights, and there are so many things that Jacqueline Cochran's name isn't attached to but should be, that it's almost criminal because of all the activities she had. And one of those was she talked Chuck Yeager and others into considering women for the Mercury 13 space program. She was a driving force behind that, and she actually got astronauts in training. Again, the US Congress was a very big opponent of hers. She testified to Congress that they could do the job, but she later withdrew it because she was afraid that with the Russians' progress in space, that if she held out for the women becoming part of the program, that it would hurt the space program overall. So she withdrew her support. All of this, she did all this before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That would have been a great assistance to her had it been passed when she was doing all these things. She and her husband built a ranch in Indio in California in the 50s, and this became their primary home. And she continued to fly well into the 1970s and continued to set speed and altitude records during that period of time. President Eisenhower remained a close personal friend, and he stayed at their ranch while he wrote his memoirs. They built a resort, her and her husband built a resort in Logan Canyon in Utah, and it's named Pine Glen Cove. And it has become famous after it became little used as one of the most famous haunted locales in the US. And that people claim that Jacqueline and Floyd's ghosts appear there regularly for people that go there and stay in the evening. Another thing about the Odlums were very generous with their wealth, and they were some of the most generous donators to charitable causes, particularly medical causes and women's causes during their last years. They gave almost 80% of their total worth to charitable groups. Her husband died in 1976 at the age of 84, and Jacqueline died August 9th, 1980 at their home in Indio at 74, and that's where she's buried. Here are some photos that tell a lot of the story about Jacqueline as sort of as a summary. You see her there with Hap Arnold when she received a Distinguished Service Cross in that upper corner. You can see her favorite plane in the picture to the right. That's the P-51 Mustang, which she had a lot to do with as a test pilot, and her recommendations were for making improvements were some of the most important into making it the outstanding prop fighter in World War II. You see a picture of her after she set a speed record, and you see a picture of the F-86 in which she broke the record down below that. There is a picture with her getting one of her Harmon trophies from Eleanor Roosevelt, and a picture of her at 19. She came a long way, baby. There is a picture of one of her racers in the lower left corner from the late 1930s. And that was one of the Sikorsky units that actually was modified to become an unsuccessful fighter at the beginning of the war. There's a picture at her home in New York City with a model of one of her aircraft. If you want a true rags to riches story, you can't find a greater one than the Jacqueline Cochran story. She is proof that sheer determination in using the tools that God gives us will allow you to succeed. She overcame the obstacle of poverty, the obstacle of lack of education, through sheer and complete absence of fear and determination. One of the things that I think created the lack of publicity, well, let's say, and acclaim for Jacqueline was the fact that since she was such a hard driving person, you had some opinion of her. You either liked her a lot or you didn't. And she made an enemy of a lot of people in the press, which at that time reflected a attitude that women should stay as feminine as possible, and they considered her as trying to make women more masculine. And of course, that was not her intent at all. All you have to do is look at her. You can tell she wasn't trying to make women masculine. one of the couple of her, the quotes that she's famous for was, she was talking about her lack of fear, and she said, "It comes with faith, for with complete faith, there is no fear of what faces you in life or death." And about her upbringing, she said, "I might have been born in a hovel, but I am determined to travel with the wind and the stars," in which she did. And she also said, after she broke the sound barrier, "To live without risk for me would be tantamount to death." And she lived that. She lived those sayings. She was true to them, and actually had a life that was a sterling example for any woman, to prove what a woman was capable of and could do. And that tells the story of Jacqueline Cochran. And at this point, I would say that if we open the mics, I'll be try to answer the questions that I can.
Thank you so much, DL. That was really fascinating. I have a page full of notes, and I just want to know more and more. I have questions of my own, but let's check and see how our audience is feeling. If anybody has a question,
Please unmute your.
unmute yourself. You can open your video.
I have a question.
Okay, Tracy.
Really?
Her early life, her first marriage, were there any pushback at all, or do we know anything about this Robert Cochran? Or must have been her toughest feat of all, getting out of a marriage. That for a woman to get out of a marriage like that in the early part of the century, I think.
Let me tell you a little bit, and it's hard to keep this to a reasonable length because there are so many good things to talk about her in so many facets. In her autobiography, and by the way, there is an autobiography. I've used 9 different books, and I made visits to go to find out stuff about her. Okay, her first marriage was a horrible thing. She was married to a man who was horribly abusive. She does not write anything in her autobiography about that period of her life, just a minimal. There's a period of time that talks about growing up and the poverty, but it abruptly halts when she's 14 and is married. And one of the reasons that it is pretty sure that she never had any children after that was the abuse and some of the things that she endured while she was married. The child died as a result of an accident, and the reason why she probably got the divorce was her husband was a drunk, and it was probable that her son died as a result of a beating that he received from the husband.
Oh, God.
Does that answer your question?
Well, that makes it even more remarkable that she was able to get out of that situation. Most people would not.
Well, as Chuck Yeager said, he never met a more competitive or stronger willed or fearless person in his life. And that's saying something.
Yeah. If I could ask, did she stay close to her stepchildren from her second marriage?
She did. And the other thing that she did was that those parents that had raised her, the Pittmans, she took care of them for the rest of their life. She did not want to be associated with the name or anything. And she quite honestly, I won't say hid them, but she didn't make any attempt to bring them into the inner circle. But she did put them out and bring them out to the ranch and supported them financially and in every way possible. And her step-parents were very much part of her life, her private life, not her public life.
Stepchildren, right? Great.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. The depending on whose account you want to read, the whole marriage with Odlum and the divorce from Hortense is described extremely differently. Okay. Some people say that the marriage was over, that Hortense was actually, and this is a fact, they only factual thing I can tell you is they did not live under the same roof for about 2 years. So that doesn't make for a very good marriage. The only thing that I can tell you was that his previous wife was very well liked in New York society, so that made it doubly tough on Jacqueline when they became married, and it was quite a scandal. It would be akin to one of the top people in the country today, one of the top industrialists, let's say Bezos or something like that, having a mistress and then marrying him. So you can get a feel for it. It actually was a lot more serious back then because people's opinions on affairs and stuff were a lot more severe then than they are now. We can't make judgments about societies in our arrears because the living conditions and how they were are completely different than what we have today. Heck, I'm old enough to know that when I wanted to communicate somebody when I was 20 or 25 and I was out on the road someplace, I had to find a payphone. I didn't have a cell phone. And all of those things, all of the time elements, all those things go into making a society what it is. So we can't really make a judgment based on what our societal norms are back in those days. And I think that it's very important that we not judge somebody like Jacqueline Cochran that way.
I think it's terrific that their marriage lasted 40 years. And when I read about Oldham, it seemed that they were extraordinarily well matched intellectually. They were both
They were
real forward thinkers.
Thank you for bringing that up. And they had an extremely happy marriage. They were best friends as well as marriage partners.
That's great to hear. She deserved everything she got. She worked for it.
Yes, she did. She worked for it. She worked for it. Quite honestly, I get a little emotional when I think about what she overcame.
Yeah. Think about all the people complaining today and you think, wow, we have so much to be grateful for. And just to know about a woman like that who opened doors for so many others and who kept creating and kept. Yeah. Thank you. This was a great talk. Thank you. It was a wonderful talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions can I answer any other questions for you?
Are the WASP still a viable organization to this day?
I'm sorry? No, they disbanded at the end of the war. There's a good story to that. At the time, Jacqueline felt like they were a stepsister to the regular Air Force. And they were considered a semi-volunteer unit, even though they were controlled and had military, they were under military rule. And she tried to get the WASPs and women made as part of a co-equal part of the Air Force and accepted as part of the Air Force. When it became very clear that some of the old line politicians would never accept that the presence of women in a fighting wing, she decided that she could no longer be part of it, and the WASP were disbanded in 44, the end of 44, or beginning of 45. At that time, it was clear who was going to win the war. Male pilots were to some degree concerned and expressed that to their congressmen. They were concerned that a lot of jobs as airline pilots and stuff might go to women because the airlines, quite honestly, still thought they could take advantage of women. Some of the airlines actually made the statement that they were looking forward to getting trained pilots that they could hire at half the rate that they did males.
Wow. Isn't that something? I bet you she would have been good in the suffrage movement in the early part of the set. She would have been one of the leaders.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, Faith,
She wasn't scared of.
she wasn't scared of anything. Yeah, that's what
She had no fear.
Faith, I'm not sure how Faith dropped out, but she's on my phone now, kind of dropped out of the, must have got off the internet. So let me just see what she has to say. Faith? She lost the connection. That's okay. That's okay. We're wrapping up. Okay. She lost her connection. Well, thank you so much, DL. And this was great. This was one of the best speaker presentations we had. I love hearing about how women and other minorities overcame the long history of this country that's set against them from the very beginning, you know? I
think it's so important. One of the things that's so important, Tracy, is the fact that this just shows you what one person can make a huge difference. Basically, all the groundwork that she laid, you think about how many things that she got involved with were the opening. Those were the cracks in the concrete wall. Okay, there was a concrete wall long before there was a glass ceiling. Believe me. And she's the one who chipped away and made those cracks that made the glass ceiling even possible.
Right. Well, it helps that she had a husband who had money too. That's.
Oh yeah, and that was part of her plan. Was that, you know,
Yeah.
like I said, she used the devices she could to do what she needed to do to achieve.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and we appreciate everybody joining in with us today. And we hope you come back. DL, you've been one of our speakers in the past. We hope you come back again in the future.
All you have to do is invite me, and you know, just as a word from yourself, if you like history, I do a lot of historical novels. I think you'll enjoy them. Look me
Okay.
up.
We
Thank you,
will.
everybody. Thank you. Another great program.
Thank you all, and have a good rest of the afternoon, and thanks for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tracy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.